Okay, welcome. So as people are getting signed in here for our everything rosé class, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. So welcome. It is a high of, I think, 96, 97 degrees today in New York City. I was just mentioning off recording a moment ago that the last time I did an in-person rosé class at Cork Buzz, it was a high of 50 degrees, and that was in April. So we're happy to have some of the warmer weather today. Rosé, I would like to, bring up a little philosophy, right, about wine at the beginning of classes. Rosé has such an interesting history, and it becomes unfortunate that we lump the style of rosé into a single category. Just as I say with things like Burgundy or Champagne, there are many different styles of rosé as there are rosé producers. And I think the fact that we have sort of lumped this style of wine into a single category has confused consumers to the style of wine that they're looking for and want to purchase. If you walk into a shop and you just say, I want a rosé, you may not end up walking out with something that you enjoy, right? And so then this sometimes turns people off from the idea of wanting to purchase or try different rosés, because it takes a little bit of practice and an understanding of how rosé wines are made to be able to select and choose the ones that we like the most. Now, it's not going to come as a surprise to you on this video that why do we like rosés in certain ways? Well, it's based on not just the fact that it is a rosé wine. What is the grape variety that we're using, or varieties if it's a blend? What is the climate that the grapes are grown in? And what is the style of wine being produced in the winery by the producer? All of these impact the final wine that we get in the bottle to enjoy. So it helped really to understand a little bit about the process of growing grapes for rosé wine, what grapes we're using, and you usually see the grape variety listed on the bottle, right? If you are buying something, especially from the United States or a new world country, it's more possible that coming from somewhere like France or Italy, you might not see the grape variety, but that's because the grape variety is hidden in the name of the region, right? That by law, in order to use a term like Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, the grape can only be Montepulciano in somewhere like Italy. So we'll talk about some of the most famous wine growing regions for rosé wines, and hopefully will help decode a little bit of this as well. Okay, so let's get started. Lots of fun things to talk about today, I think. Please let me know if you do have any questions. Go ahead and interrupt me at any time. Take yourself off mute. Put something in the chat box. And as people are signing in, I always like to say, share with your community, right? So if you've been to any of the rosé wine regions that we'll be discussing, if you have a favorite rosé wine, if there's something you buy by the case, I buy Ernest Rosé by the case every summer. I got it for because when you buy it sometimes, by the case, you get such a steep discount. So this went from like $25 to $15 a bottle. It's Pinot Noir from California, from the Sonoma coast. So it's actually a cooler wine growing region in California, and it's low alcohol. It's I think 11.5%. This always tends to be I'm looking for my chat so I can put that in there for you. This always tends to be my summertime rosé, and I really love these Ernest wines. I'm gonna put it here so you can see that. It's called Ernest is the producer. They're based in Sonoma coast. And the wine that I bought last year and this year is called Eugenia. It's from Pinot Noir. Just share that with you. I love this wine. It's light and fresh and juicy and has a lot of impact of flavor, but with the kind of lighter, fresher palate that we really want in a rosé wine, and is one of the reasons we drink rosé wine, right? So what will we be talking about today? A history, and also some of the oldest accounts of drinking pink wine. And also, of course, we'll talk about some of the more modern accounts of drinking pink wine. How do we make rosé wine? Now, this is really where we start to look at the intention of the production of rosé wine. Although this is a fun summertime class just meant to fill, a quick, fast, fun evening hour of your evening, it is still intentional. And for a long time, rosé was not necessarily an intentionally made wine, but that has certainly changed today with the popularity of rosé increasing. So has oftentimes the intention and the quality of the rosé that are being made as well. So we'll talk about how do we make rosé wines. It's not all made the same way. Not all rosé wine is equal, and not all rosé wine, as we know, of course, is of the same quality. So we'll talk about the most popular or delicious regions for the production of rosé wine. And of course, we always love to talk about some perfect pink pairings too. So a couple of wines that we worked with our friends at Ludu's to bring to you today. If you ordered these wines from Ludu's and you have them open, please let us know what you're thinking. And if you haven't ordered these wines, that's fine. We'd love to hear about everything that you're drinking anyways, but we always say vote with your dollar. It's not just about rosé wine. I think I shared the last time I did this as a virtual class, I might have shared this story too, but one of my very first, the first year I was working at Cork Buzz, it's like 7 years ago now, it was summertime, and I think we had, at that time, something like 7 rosés by the glass. And I had a girl that came in and she sat down, and I offered to get her a glass of wine. She said she would have rosés. I would like, wonderful. What rosé would you like? We have these different options. And she said to me, I can't tell the difference, so just bring me the cheapest. And I said, oh, okay. And that's what I did. And then I always, literally almost immediately, regretted that. I was like, wow, this could have been such a great, learning moment. And to see how then these rosés do not all taste the same, right? They are different. And then also, why are we supporting the winemakers behind these specific brands too? So Bedrock is a wine that is very, very near and dear to our hearts at Cork Buzz. This is the Ode to Lulu Mourvèdre blend rosé coming from Sonoma County. Bedrock is the project of Master of Wine, Morgan Twain Peterson. You may have heard this name before. You may be familiar with the Peterson name in Sonoma, if you're a fan of California wine. Morgan's father was a man named Joel Peterson, who was the winemaker at Ravenswood Winery. So really focused on Zinfandel wines at Ravenswood. And Morgan grew up in the Ravenswood Winery. And he's very much like his father. He's a great champion of California's old vine heritage. They have an estate vineyard called Bedrock, but they also source from other old vine vineyards like Evangelo, places in Contra Costa in California. Oftentimes these vines are more than a century in age. He does some single varietal wines, he does blends, he does some field blends where they pick all of the grapes and co-ferment them in the vineyard together. And in some of these older vineyards, that's just how the vines are planted as well, right? You would replant 1 or 2 vines at a time with whatever you happen to have on hand. So some of these vines date up to 100, 120, or even older. Oftentimes they come from Mourvèdre, Zinfandel, Carignan, Alicante Boucher, Syrah is very common. Cinsault you'll see as well. Morgan actually started making his first wines at the age of 5. So he started Bedrock in 2000, I believe, I want to say 2007, although I might remember that wrong, but sometime in the 2000s. After living in New York, he went to Vassar. But really started making wines at the age of 5. So his father let him smell and taste the small amounts of these different Pinot Noirs, and he was really inspired by how different they were. And after smelling through these different wines, Morgan, at 5 years old in 1986, decided that Domaine Dujac was his favorite Pinot Noir producer. It's a really renowned producer in Burgundy in France. And he made a project from 1986 to 2001 that was known as Vino Bambino. And it was sold all over the country, and especially to New York City restaurants like Kraft, Gramercy Tavern, Blue Hill had the 1986 vintage, the very first one on their list, Delmonico's, Oriole. And so you can see that he had quite a bit of experience in winemaking. Ode to Lulu is an homage to Lulu Perron of Domaine Tempier in Bandol, which we will talk about in a bit as well. And although the vintage can change the blend of the wine, the 2021 is Mourvèdre Grenache Cinsault. I didn't see on the website an exact reference to the blend itself, what percentages of each grape variety, but the basis of the wine is always old vine, Mourvèdre, or Mataro. Mataro and Mourvèdre are the same grape, just two different terms they use for it. So what would you have something like this with? They really pick these grapes on the kind of fresher, like not underripe, but just ripe side, so that they have this sort of electric lightning bolt acidity to them. So you can certainly have this with anything that you would need a little acidity with, right? If you're trying to match up to the acidity in some types of fruit, watermelon salad with something like salty and acidic feta cheese. I would love this with like a caprese salad, heirloom tomatoes. You could do that with a little bit of balsamic, right? Cheese, mozzarella cheese, some basil, maybe a little bit of pesto on that. You could have it with something like paella. It has enough texture to stand up to sausage. And then also it's fresh enough to be great with things like shrimp or octopus, clam. You could have it with jambalaya. I love in the summertime, I love a BLT and rosé. Fresh, bacon, lettuce, tomato, all of those wonderful, wonderful things. So if you ever do run into these wines, there's not a ton of either of these two wines made, either the Bedrock or the Clos Cibonne that I'm going to show you next of this particular cuvee. Anyways, Clos Cibonne does make larger amounts of other kinds of wine or other bottling, but not of this one. I definitely recommend that you do pick those up. So the second wine we're featuring, Clos Cibonne, Cuvée de Spéciale Vignettes. Clos Cibonne is probably the only wine that had been on the Cork Buzz wine list since Cork Buzz's inception. It has always been on the list, and for out of the 12 years, 11, 12 years that Cork Buzz has been open now, the majority of that time it has actually been by the glass. So we don't have it by the glass at the moment, but we do have it on the list, both at Union Square and at Chelsea Market. So this is a property that dates back to the late 1700s, and it's been in the family of a family named the Roux. So in 1930, Andre Roux modernized the winery because he really wanted to pursue quality winemaking within this region. Now, 1930s, in Provence, this really was important for Rosé, but not the top style of production that we were making during this time. But his revival ignited an era of fame for the rosés, not only of Provence, but especially of the Clos Cibonne winery itself. Andre's granddaughter, Brigitte, and her husband took over the property in the 1990s. There is a classification system in Provence, and this is one of 18 cru classés or classified estates in the Côtes de Provence as well. And this is a grape called Tibouren. So it's an ancient Provençal grape. It's the heart of what they do at Clos Cibonne. And the estate, Clos Cibonne, is synonymous with the Tibouren grape. So synonymous, in fact, that as far as I know, Clos Cibonne is the only winery in France that is allowed to list the name of the appellation, Côtes de Provence, with a different grape than is actually allowed by the appellation. So in Côtes de Provence, when you make rosé wine, it has to be a blend of at least two grape varieties. And usually the basis of the blend is Grenache. But however, Clos Cibonne was able to petition to the INAO, and they said, listen, we've been making this wine in this style since at least the 1930s, if not even previously. The heart of the estate has always been the Tibouren grape, and they're actually able to bottle this 100% Tibouren and still keep the Côtes de Provence AOC title as well. So these vineyards are very close to the coast, and the wine ages for a year just at the property before it's ever released. So it ages actually in barrel, fermented in stainless steel, but ages in barrel under under a veil of yeast. So in a way, almost like sherry ages. This is not a fortified wine like sherry, and it doesn't have a lot of sherry is aged under yeast and then also additionally oxidatively. So it gets those like nutty caramel characters and flavors to it. This does not have that, but it does have a little bit of this sort of like green olive, like Marcona almond, a little bit of this kind of sharp chamomile top note to it because of this floor that grows, this yeast that grows on the top of the wine. What would you have something like this with? Well, this is the wine that you can age. You can drink it now, it's delicious. But you can age this wine for up to, I mean, at least 10 years or longer. Ryan has actually been to the property before, and he said that he had rosé, I think, dating back to the 1970s, and that they were still absolutely delicious. Of course, those would be very like tertiary wines. They're not going to have those fresh fruit flavors after that amount of time, but he said the wines were still very drinkable. So this is something you would have with a lot of the fresh seafood. When we talk about rosé wines, a lot of the world's rosés are made in areas close to water. So you can just assume that what grows together goes together. You would have this with sardines, octopus, you know, metze. You could have it with vegetables that are covered in herb de Provence, right? You could have this with hard cheeses of the South. All of these would be fantastic pairing for the Côtes de Provence. I like to talk about these wines right up at the beginning because sometimes we get to the end of class and you're like, I've been drinking this delicious wine the whole time and I don't know anything about it. So now let's get into some of the history of drinking peak wine. So in Greek mythology and fiction would mix red wine with water to cut back on drunkenness amongst his counselors. So this is one of the first accounts that we have of rosé wine. So we wanted to, at these meetings, we wanted to have a little bit to drink, and this would sort of bring some spirited discourse into the conversation without kind of falling back on outright drunkenness. So we would dilute the wine, the red wine, making them a little bit more rosé. Although we had a lot of shorter macerations and faster fermentation. So back in the day, it probably is not uncommon to think that almost all wine might have been sort of a very, very pale, almost deep rosé color because of we don't have the modern winemaking that we have today. It's also probably common that they would have mixed white and red grapes more often during the winemaking process during this time. In 600 BC, Greeks bring vines to the south of France. This is the very first evidence that we have of the grapes arriving into France, and this is in the Provence area, what would become known as Provence. In 125 BC, the Romans arrive, and they bring red winemaking techniques. And this is because the Romans really had such a prolific love for wine, and as they expanded their empire, they were really able to experiment with the best way to grow grapes, to trellis these vines, right? To ensure that we had a photosynthesis to ripen the grape berries, would ensure that we would keep them free of mold and mildew and fungus by lifting those grapes away from the ground on the trellis. They were the first to use things like glass bottles, cork closures. And then they were really the first to begin to really understand terroir, adaptability, how certain grape varieties do better in specific climates, soils, even aspects or locations on a hillside. And they really took advantage of a lot of these things that they learned. So they were able to make more of a modern style of white wine that we know today and more of a modern style of red wine that we know today as well. However, the areas where they still continue to remain highly acclaimed. In the Middle Ages, most of us are familiar with a term called claret. It was a dark rosé coming from Bordeaux, and it was especially prized in the British market. And the Brits really preferred the vin d'une nuit, which is the wine of one night. That would be a reference to the amount of time, about 24 hours, that the grapes would spend with the skin, absorbing some of that color. So it would be this really like pale red or very, very deep rosé. They preferred these wines of one night versus the vin vermeil, or what they would call sort of the ruby wines of the region. In Champagne, we were also attempting to make both white and red wine. However, we were making wines in Champagne from thin skin grape varieties, right? Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier. In Champagne, they would often, during this time in the Middle Ages and past, they would actually color the juice of their wines with things like elderberry. They were trying to emulate the wines that were being made in places like Burgundy. And it was just such a cooler climate, especially at that time. They really couldn't make the wines quite like they were making in places like Burgundy. And so they would make these wines from Pinot Noir, and they would come out as what they kind of called this eye of the partridge, the oil they produce. And this was the idea that this was the kind of like pinkish gray color of the eye of a partridge. And it wasn't until Dom Perignon, who a lot of people attribute to being the person who discovered the process of making sparkling wine, which was not actually true. But what Dom Perignon did was he was really one of the first to really understand that concept of that clean press of the white juice of the grape away from the red skin to make the style of wine that we call today Blanc de Noir, right? White wine coming from black grapes. Post-World War II, Rosé really explodes in a lot of other places in the world outside of Europe. Two Portuguese brands known as Mateus and Lancers really led this charge. They sold lots of wine to especially British, Northern Europe, and the American. The Mateus and Lancers rosés were slightly off dry, so they had a little fresh sweetness to them. Sometimes they were a little bit fizzy. They were very like easy to drink, not complicated wines to understand and enjoy. They became very, very popular, much like the success of white Zinfandel in the US. This really helped, in a way, propel some of the fame of Portuguese wines and also keep around some of those winemaking regions that may have otherwise been lost. In 1975, we see white Zinfandel for the first time. There is a lot to talk about with the concept of white Zinfandel, and I don't want to go on too long about it, but there was a winemaker for Sutter Home, and his name was Bob Trinchero. And he was fermenting their wines, their Cabernet Sauvignon. And he had what we call a stuck fermentation. So a stuck fermentation is when the yeast stopped doing its job. And the wine stopped fermenting. So when this happens, it leaves us with a wine that has some alcohol, but some sugar in it. Usually we're not absorbing as much color from the skin once the fermentation stops, because the fermentation also creates heat and it agitates the juice, right? And so you really press out a lot of the color from the skin. And this is one thing we haven't mentioned yet, but I think a lot of us know is when I mentioned before, the color of the juice of the wine comes from the skins of the grape. So as I mentioned with that Blanc de Noir in Champagne, with almost every red grape, when you peel the red skin away, the flesh inside is clear. So this is how we can make white wine coming from black grapes if we don't involve the skins in the winemaking, right? And this is how we can make a rosé wine from a red grape if we only involve the skins for a shorter period of time, or if the fermentation is not doing its job. One of which those jobs is not just turning sugar into alcohol, but also gaining all those colors, phenolics, and tannins from the skins of the grape as well. So Bob Trinchero suffers a stuck fermentation. It's the middle of harvest. He says, I don't really have time to deal with this barrel. He puts the barrel aside, and he comes back to it a few weeks later, and he tastes the wine inside, and he thinks, this isn't half bad. So he also has a wine writer that's visiting at the time. And the wine writer says, oh, this is a really great Cabernet blush. And that kind of is one of the things that kind of skyrocketed that style to fame. Now, there's a couple of other things about what's happening in 1975 and the early 1980s. So America prefers, we're still coming out of the ravages of the effect that prohibition had on the American palate for drinking beverages and wine. So a lot of the American palate is still drinking these maybe slightly sweet, usually white wine with the preferred style of wine during this time. And we have all this vast Zinfandel and other red wine acreage in California. And we were able to start making the concept of white Zinfandel, right? Which is a blush style of wine made from red Zinfandel grapes. I had a woman one time when she looked at a restaurant I worked at years ago in Seattle, but she looked at the list and we had a Zinfandel with a red wine. She said, I'll have a glass of this, please. And I brought it to her and she looked at it. She was like, what is this? And I was like, oh, this is a Zinfandel. And she's like, no, it's not. Zinfandel is pink. And it was just sort of interesting because she had never seen a red Zinfandel before. She'd only ever been exposed to it as a rosé or blush wine made from these red grapes. So what happened was that the idea of this white Zinfandel or blush wine made all of this vast acreage of red grape varieties accessible to a primarily white wine drinking public in the United States. It also made wine easier and accessible, like as I mentioned before, a little bit sweet. White Zinfandel would oftentimes have white grape varieties added to it that had a lot of aromatics, things like Riesling or Gewürztraminer, something like Muscat to add those kind of floral, fruity aromatic to the wine as well. In 1980, Sutter Home, I wrote this down, Sutter Home produced 25,000 cases of wine. By 1986, they were producing 1.5 million cases of wine. So this really tells you how this kind of blush wine explosion and frenzy just took over America. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to California too. So as we drink rosé wine around the world, we always think of Provence, the unofficial capital of rosé wine. In Provence, the wines are blends, the exception of which I showed you earlier, the Clos Cibonne, from Grenache, Cinsault, Syrah, Mourvèdre, Carignan, a minimum of 2 grape varieties. It's an area near the Mediterranean coast, so you have a coastal climate, you have dry and sunny summers, you have very temperate winters. Oftentimes the wines of Provence are said to be scented of the garrigue, especially the higher quality examples of those wines. The garrigue is this vegetation that sort of grows over the landscape in Provence in the south of France or places like Corsica, if you've been there. It's this mix of lavender and sage and thyme, these kind of woody stemmy herbs that just are really, really fragrant and aromatize the air in the south of France, especially in the summer. In the Loire Valley, we make rosé. In Burgundy, we make rosé. In the Languedoc and in Champagne, we make rosé. Spain is well known for its rosados as well, especially from regions like Navarra or Segales. In Italy, we have rosato or chiaretto, wines like Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, and of course, California. But I mean, that's just not everywhere, right? If you think about rosé wine, if somebody makes wine, they probably make rosé these days. And some of that is for economic reasons, not just because rosé is popular, but because we can, release rosé sooner, right? So it's really an economic advantage to make some rosés. And it can also be an economic advantage because you might be able to use red wine vineyards that you might not think are mature enough for red wines for rosés. Now, this would not necessarily be the most intentional style of rosé, but it does give a producer or a grower an opportunity to make money over a harvest or a vintage, right? So how do these rosés get pink? So rosé wines are usually made from red grapes, and less often they can be made by blending red and white juice. This is only allowed in certain countries and regions. We don't typically see this in France, except for one area we'll talk about. One of the main styles of rosé production is a style called saunier. Saunier means to bleed in French, and the idea of this is you take some of the red juice as it's fermenting away from the skins, and then you increase the proportion of those skins to the remaining juice. So that rosé is actually a byproduct of the production of red wine. Your remaining red wine that's still fermenting with the skin is going to be more concentrated, right? Because you've increased the level of skin where you're getting the tannin phenolic, the color, to the level of juice or wine. The second method is skin contact. This is the most common style of making rosé today. It's considered to be the highest quality. The white juice will sit with the red skin for a short period of time. So this is going to be a shorter period of time than we make for our red wines. And just like red wine, how long you choose to let the juice stay with the skin will inform the finished style. The third style is blending, where you can actually mix white wine and red wine together and make a rosé wine. This is becoming much more popular, I think, in the natural wine community. We see a lot of this, especially in places like Portugal, where traditional field blends have always been the way that wines have been made, and now they're becoming a little bit more popular. A lot of natural winemakers are making their wines this way. Most rosé regions in France do not allow the blending of white and red grapes to make rosé. Typically in almost every region, the only exception in France is Champagne. Your rosé wines have to be made from either the saunier or the skin contact or maceration method. The intensity of color or the lack of the intensity of color is not an indication of the quality of the wine. We hear this quite often at Cork Buzz. Oftentimes consumers will associate a more deeply colored rosé with more sugar, but that just simply is not the truth. A lot of people think that the sort of paler rosé wines are mean that the wine is of higher quality, but that's not necessarily truthful either. It's not. You can have a very high quality pale rosé, but you can also have a very high quality deeply colored rosé. So the intensity of color or the lack of intensity of color is an indication of either the grape variety and or the winemaking technique that's been used to make the rosé wine. And why is that? Because if we're making rosé wine primarily from red grapes, we understand that every red grape or every variety of red grape is a little bit different. So we don't usually see rosé made from Cabernet Sauvignon. That doesn't mean it does not exist, because it does. It's not a very common style of wine to see for rosé. The reason is because Cabernet grapes really have to be quite ripe in order to not be too herbaceous or to have like these kind of green underripe flavors. And we usually pick red grapes for rosé wine a little earlier, so they retain more of that freshness, right? So oftentimes Cabernet grape picked for rosé production might be a little bitter, slightly astringent, underripe. But however, if you do have a ripe enough Cabernet grape and it's still maintaining enough acidity and you want to make rosé wine out of it, that could be a much more deeply colored rosé wine than probably something made from, for example, Pinot Noir, a very thin skin grape, which also doesn't need quite as much ripeness. We kind of expect a little bit of that tartness sometimes coming from Pinot Noir. I like to add an orange wine slide. We won't spend too much on this, just because it's the same style of winemaking for rosé wines as orange wine. So I like to say that rosé is white is to orange as rosé is to red, or orange is to white as rosé is to red, right? And that means that we know that the rosé wines are made from a red grape with usually a saunier or a shorter maceration than the red wine. While orange wines are made from white grapes with a longer maceration with the skins than for a white wine. Typically in white wine production, we don't use the skins at all. We will just press the juice away from the skins immediately and ferment it on its own. But in orange wine, depending again on the style you're making, you can spend a couple of hours or anywhere up to 6 months with the skins of the grape. So in traditional Georgian winemaking, it's an 8,000-year-old process of fermenting the crushed whole berries in clay vessels. And these will sometimes ferment for up to 6 months. Usually not longer, but that's very common to see them up to 6 months. They have a lot of tannin, right? They're very, very deep in color, almost like they call them actually amber wines because the color is just so intense. In the early 2000s, winemakers from the Friuli region, like Josko Gravner in Italy, visited Georgia, and they brought some of these ancient techniques back to Friuli. And he was really responsible for a resurgence in the orange wine style. And Gravner was, prior to this, he was a very traditional kind of commercial white wine producer, but he was really impressed by what he saw in Georgia. We take the white grape, we crush them, macerate with the skins and sometimes the stems, as little as 1 week, as long as a year. orange wines have also become associated with the natural wine movement, but just because the wine is orange does not mean it falls under this umbrella, because the only tenet of orange wine is that you have to use the skins for the fermentation, right? So that doesn't mean that the grapes have to be organic or biodynamic or sustainable. It doesn't mean that it's made in a natural style without any additional additives or taking anything away from the wine, which is one of the tenets of natural winemaking. But oftentimes, they do have some crossover here. So it's very common that just like a natural wine producer trying not to add anything or take anything away from the wine that they're making and the grape variety, they see using the skin as sort of an extension of the tenets of natural winemaking. We will see a variation in orange wine styles and flavors, just like rosé, due to grape variety, length of maceration, terroir, winemaking technique. And what you really get from orange wines and the skins for the white wine is a contribution to the color of the body, the tannin. And usually you get more developed aromas and flavors. It's kind of like dried fruits and nut characteristic to the wine, a little bit more like citrus peel, and maybe a slight potpourri character too. And that could come from including the stem during the fermentation too. So how are we producing rosé wine? You can destem your grapes, but you don't have to. You can crush your grapes, but you don't have to. And then here are three of the styles that we mentioned, except for the concept of blending, which is not in this diagram here. So at the top, this is what we call a direct press. So direct press will usually produce the lightest style of rosé wine. There is a style in France, and you'll see the name appropriated in other countries as well, but it's called vin gris. And essentially vin gris wines in France are rosé wines that are made from very thin skin grape with a direct press. So you might crush the grape with the skin, which releases some of the color of the skin into the juice, but very little. And then you immediately press the grape. So you have these very, very lightly colored, very light tannin style of rosé wine. And they're also already coming from thin skin grape, which already have less color and less tannin as well. You have your Cuvée rapide. This is also your maceration, or your kind of fermenting for a short period of time with the skins of the grape. So you can destem or not, you can crush, but then you do need to crush for this style where you would cold soak and let the juice sit with the skins. And usually for rosé production, this is anywhere from maybe 4 hours to sometimes 4 days, right? Then you might press that colored juice away from the skin, and then you would ferment the juice at the color and the intensity that you wanted on its own. And then we have the concept of the saigné we mentioned, right? The concept of bleeding a little bit of the juice away from your red wine. So we take our grapes and we crush them, we cold soak them, we soak them with the juice, with the skin to gain that color, that tannin, those phenolics. And then we press a little bit of the juice away and we leave the remaining juice still in contact with the skin, right? So we're deepening that color, that intensity in the remaining red wine. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is not always considered to be the highest quality technique for rosé winemaking. And that's because typically this style is thought to be made as rosé as more of an afterthought, because usually the style is not focused on the quality of the rosé, it's focused on the quality of the red wine. And producers would just choose to take this rosé juice that's been bled from the tanks of their red wine, and they would sell it, you know, kind of locally at the wine, in their winery. They would drink it themselves. And over time, especially in places like Provence, where a lot of monasteries and abbeys were doing these saigné styles, they would actually decide to sell this wine because it was an opportunity to bring a lot of money into the winery before you were actually selling your red wine, right? When do we think about releasing rosés for the season? Usually it's springtime. It's April and May. That's when we really start to see, sometimes as early as March, we start to see the first release of the previous harvest rosés, right? So it's an opportunity to get income immediately from the previous harvest while your red wines are still fermenting in tank or barrel, or still aging in tank or barrel. So just to keep that in mind. All right, let's talk about some of these regions. I hope we're having fun. Oops, go back there. It's always fun to talk about these different rosé wines, right? So France produces 27% of the global rosé production. That is a lot. France is not that large of a country. They don't actually make wine everywhere like they do in Italy, right? We talk about this all the time. They really focus the wine production in France and the grape varieties within those regions. Where the grapes grow best, right? So if we were to look, for example, I think a map of Italy is a few from here. So literally every spot is colored in a wine producing area in Italy because it is. If you're not in the city and you're not on a mountaintop, you're probably growing grapevines somewhere in Italy. In France, a slightly cooler climate. So we concentrate the growing of the grapes into these smaller regions, right? So the fact that they produce 27% of the world rosé is pretty incredible. Provence, the official, unofficial capital of rosé wines, 75% of all the rosé that's made in France comes from Provence, based on Grenache primarily, but could be blended with any of the following: Syrah, Mourvèdre, Cinsault, Carignan. You can blend some of the Tibouren into your rosé wines coming from Provence as well. We mentioned that Provençal herbs and brush, right? Think of the herb de Provence, what you would get in that tin of seasoning the last time you visited France and you brought home some of that herb de Provence. You have a little bit of that garrigue scent to the wine, that sage, that thyme, that rosemary, that lavender, a little bit of that fennel seed, right? It gives you that slight licorice character sometimes that you get. Bandol AOP are Mourvèdre based wines for the rosés, usually 20 to 95%. And Champagne, as we move a little bit further north, so Provence is down here, Champagne's in the north. So just right away, what is the biggest difference in these styles of wine? Well, of course, they're different grape varieties. We're basing rosé wines in Champagne on Pinot Noir, Meunier, and also Chardonnay, because the wines can be blends of red and white grapes, right? Red and white wines here. But it's a much cooler climate. So we're thinking higher acid, more minerality, a leaner, more linear palate. Provence will be rounder, riper. Even though there's still kind of fresh wine coming from Provence, they can be a little salty and that kind of herbal character from the garrigue. It is a riper, warmer climate. And Grenache is a grape that prefers a riper, warmer palate. So you'll definitely get that roundness here. The wines of Champagne will be more tart than the wines of Provence. They must be made in either blending or Saunier style. And then you also have two still wine appellations in Champagne. They're not called Champagne. So if it says Champagne on the bottle, it has to be sparkling. But if you see Rosé de Rosé, this is an appellation also based or within the boundaries of Champagne for still rosé wine coming from 100% Pinot Noir from the village of Rosé in the Aube. It's only made in the very best years. They have intense ageability to them. Rosé de Rosé, it does have this beautiful, because they're made in ripe years, this kind of beautiful ripe, almost like a fruit snack, red fruit to it, but they can also be kind of mushroomy and like a little bit on the umami side too. They're really beautiful styled. You might also see Coteau Champenois Rosé, which is Coteau Champenois is an appellation in Champagne for still wine, and you can make white rosé or red in Coteau Champenois. Loire Valley also produces a ton of rosé. They make a lot of it. In fact, if you're at the bistros in Paris right now, if you're going there this summer, I'm sure you'll see a lot of Loire Valley wine. Loire is quite close to Paris, but you'll also see a lot of rosé wine. So it can be a little bit confusing on how to tell some of these styles apart, but the wines from Loire Valley are typically also based oftentimes on blend, but not always. They can be Grollo, Cabernet Franc, Pinot Noir. You have grapes like Pinot d'Agny. You might even see Côtes, which is the Loire term for Malbec. Chinon AOP is a appellation we know well for red wine from Cabernet Franc. But if you see a Chinon Rosé, it's also made from Cabernet Franc. We think of Sancerre as an appellation for white wine from Sauvignon Blanc, but they do allow red and rosé wine production. If you're making a white wine in Sancerre, it has to be Sauvignon Blanc. But if you see a rosé or red wine in Sancerre, it's coming from Pinot Noir. It can only be from Pinot Noir. Only about maybe 4-6% of all of the wines made in Sancerre are rosé or red. It's a very small amount. There are 3 other terms for rosé wines in Loire you might see. Cabernet d'Anjou, from a blend typically of Cabernet Franc and some Cabernet Sauvignon, is a sweeter style of rosé. By law, it has to be, I think, above 9 grams per liter of residual sugar. Rosé d'Anjou is an off-dry style, and if you see Rosé de Loire on the label, this is your dry style. In Burgundy, you got it. We're using the same grapes that we see for the red wine. So Pinot Noir in the Côte d'Or, and Gamay coming from Beaujolais. See, Gamay Rosé or Beaujolais Rosé will be from Gamay as well. Marcenais is the most northern village in the Côte Nuit or in the Côte d'Or. For the production of wine, and they actually produce, it's the only village that's allowed to produce in Burgundy all 3 colors of wine. So rosé, red, and white wine can come from Marcenais. Tavel AOP is in the southern Rhone Valley, so it's near like Châteauneuf-du-Pape. These are also Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre blend. Tavel is an appellation that is only for rosé wines. The Languedoc, as we move a little closer to the border with France, you'll oftentimes see inexpensive, fresh rosés here, also made from those Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre blend. And some of my favorite, often overlooked rosés in France come from the island of Corsica. So these can be based on Grenache. Corsica is a French island, but they have a lot of influence from Italy over here. So Tuscany just off the coast of Corsica. You can barely see in this photo or this picture, this map here, this little tiny bit of an island that's south of Corsica, and that's Sardinia, so an Italian island. I think they're only separated by something like 11 miles. So Corsica also has a lot of influence of Italian grape varieties. So Nieluccio, it's a Corsican term for Sangiovese. Sciaccarello, it's a Corsican term for Mamolo, which is another Tuscan red grape that you'll see in Italy. And I love the wines of Corsica, and I think that they often get overlooked because people look at the names like Nieluccio and Sciaccarello and think, no, I don't know what that is. But I like to say that oftentimes the wines of Corsica are Italian grapes with French style. And I think that if you have the opportunity to taste one of these wines, whether they're rosé or red, you'll get a little bit of what that means. All right, so 3 producers just to shout out to really fast. So the top one is Domaine Tempier. If you're drinking the Bedrock Ode to Lulu, that wine is an ode to Lulu, Lulu Peyraud. She was the dame of Domaine Tempier. So her name, Lulu, she was Lulu Tempier, and she married her husband, Lucien Peyraud, who became sort of the father of Bandol. And Lucien would really wanted to be a winemaker. That was not his profession when they were married, and they moved to her family's estate. And Lucien and Lulu, along with the producers from Domaine des Pibernons and also Domaine Prado, really helped establish this region known as Bandol for both red and rosé wine. So Bandol is a little bit of an anomaly in Provence, and the wines are based on the Mourvèdre grape, and typically the rosés as well as the reds are. And they're a little bit meatier. Mourvèdre is a little bit more like Syrah, I would say, than necessarily like Grenache. It's darker fruited, it's more plummy, it's kind of peppery, it has these like aromas and flavors of smoked meat, it has higher tannin. I actually opened just last week Domaine Prado Red Bandol Rouge from 2015, and it was wonderful. It was rustic in the most perfect way. The Bandol wine can have a little bit less polish than some of the other areas of Provence, but really I would say in some of the best ways possible. So some examples of what you might see, of course, one of our favorites, the Clos Cibonne. This is Yves Leccia. He makes rosés based on Grenache and Neoluccio coming from Corsica, Corsican producers. Domaine des Fonsants, this is a vinegary style. You can see the delicate color of the wine. Tavel, this is the co-op. They make more than half of all of the wine that comes out of Tavel. Sancerre, what's the grape if it's rosé or red? Pinot Noir. And Chinon Rosé, what's the grape if it's Chinon Rosé, the grape is Cabernet Franc. So they can be a little more on the herbaceous side, slightly vegetal in their flavors, because Cabernet Franc does have those green notes to it. So a little bit more like green tea, bell pepper, forest floor, and the Chinon Rosés. They're really great summer vegetable wine, the Chinon Rosé, because of that kind of green herbaceousness. So if you're looking for rosé to have with salad, with green vegetable that you're throwing on the grill, definitely check out a Chinon Rosé or any rosé made from the Cabernet Franc grape. Well, we can't only talk about France. So moving into Italy, we talk about most of our rosés as rosato styles. Cereswolo d'Abruzzo is a favorite of ours. Abruzzo is an area that's located on the east coast of Italy, the pink area here. It comes from the Montepulciano grape. So many of us have probably had the red Montepulciano d'Abruzzo wine. Cereswolo d'Abruzzo is the rosé version. So Cereswolo d'Abruzzo is an appellation for rosé wines only based on the Montepulciano grape, coming from the same boundaries as Montepulciano d'Abruzzo. Cereswolo is a word that you see oftentimes in Italian wine region, but it just means cherry red. So you see this, and it's a reference to the cherry red hue of the rosé wines. And the reason is that Montepulciano is has a very colored skin. There's a lot of color in the juice of the red wines, and resultingly a lot of color in the juice of the rosé wines as well. If you kind of like these sort of, beautiful, fragrant rosé styles, if you go to the Veneto, you'd probably enjoy Chiaretto di Bardolino. If you are a fan of Valpolicella or Amarone, the Chiaretto di Bardolino is based on the same grape varieties. In Piedmont, you can see rosés based on Nebbiolo. Pella Verga, which is sort of like a lighter, almost like Pinot Noir-esque in its body grape variety in Piedmont, but also tend to be very, very peppery. You'll see rosés based on Barbera as well. They're juicy, light, fruity, very delicious. And a lot of Barolo producers make rosés. So, today, and I've kind of hinted at this a little bit, but now today, the production of rosé wine and the growing of grapes for rosé wine is much more intentional, meaning that producers today are more likely to choose grape varieties specifically for the style of rosé that they want to make, but they're also more likely to give some of their prime planting spots or their prime kind of vineyard land, some of the best areas, to the production of rosé grapes. But oftentimes when producers are growing younger, new grapes for red wine production, they might need something to do with them in some of the interim years, that they're just not mature enough yet to produce rosé wine. So they might use them for the production, or excuse me, of red wine. So they might use them for the production of rosé. And so that's not uncommon to see in places like Piedmont. And somewhere like Barolo, you're probably not likely to plant grapes just for rosé production, because think about, you're making 20 euros on your bottle of rosé that you cannot label it Barolo, even if the grapes come from that region, because Barolo can only be red wine from Nebbiolo. And you can make 20 euros for that, or you can make 60 euros for your Barolo. So just to keep some of these things in mind for these producers and the commercial reasons that they might sell these wines as rosé before selling them as reds. In Sicily, great rosé wine coming from Mount Etna, the active volcano located on the eastern side of the island, based primarily on a grape called Nerello Mascalese. These will be light and fresh, but kind of smoky wines as well. They have a really interesting intensity of this kind of like almost like bitter almond and kind of cherry fruit to them. If you've ever had like Kirsch liqueur. It's a little bit of that flavor to it. It's not strong like that. It's still a wine. It's not made with that high of an alcohol or anything, but I think a lot of that kirsch flavor and that kind of bitter almond and that smokiness that you get from those volcanic soils. You might find rosés from Nero d'Avola or Frappato, two of the other indigenous grapes on the island of Sicily as well. In Puglia, the heel of the boot, you see a lot of rosés coming from Primitivo. What is Primitivo? It's known in the United States as Zinfandel. So it's almost like the Italian version of white Zinfandel, right? They don't market it that way. This is a style of wine that they've been making in Italy, in Puglia, for decades. But you might also see rosés coming from the Negromaro grape variety. In Lombardy in the north, up at the border with Switzerland, you see Chiaretto from Valtonese, which I really like. The Gropello grape can be really fantastic. And then don't overlook the orange wine. So the Ramato wine coming from Friuli. We talked about Josko Grobner. He visited Georgia before coming all the way like over here. I mean, I think this map is just covering where Georgia would be. But I could be wrong because I can't really actually see the map. But on the other side of the Black Sea over here, right? So Pinot Grigio, Ribolla Gialla, Malvasia, Grosvenor, Radicon are some really great producers to look from, making wine from those grape varieties. So we have Cantinart, this is Cereswallo d'Abruzzo, or Cereswallo d'Abruzzo here. The Cantinart, I think this is Etna. Valtonese, the Gropello grape. Here we have Girolamo Russo, really important producer on Mount Etna as well. Josko Grosvenor, Radicon, important orange wine producers coming from Friuli. And then Spain. Spain has a huge history with the production of rosé wine. Oftentimes, those wines have been associated with sweetness, but that's more because of their deep color. And that's just the stylistic preference of the way that Spanish rosados were made for a very long time. But if you go to places like Basque Country, you'll see the Chocolina region making wine from Anduribi Belza, which is the native red grape. And Anduribi Zuri. Anduribi Belza is related to Cabernet Franc, so it does have some of that green herbaceousness to it. These rosé wines are oftentimes bottled with a little natural sprit to them, carbon dioxide that's left over from the fermentation. So they're really, really fresh and crisp and salty wine. So this area, Chocolina, Basque Country, is not even actually on this map, but it's just right up here, right on the kind of Bay of Biscay, like San Sebastian, Bilbao area. So if you're there having barnacles and razor clams and octopus, you really can't have anything better than the white or rosé wines of Chocolina. You might oftentimes see them, they're poured usually from really high up through a spout that kind of help the wine fizz up a little bit as well. So Navarra, primarily based on Garnacha. Also in Rioja, you see a lot of rosé wines. Those can be based on Tempranillo, but also on Garnacha too. There's no actual regulations for how much of these grape varieties you have to have in Rioja. So though we associate Rioja wines as being Tempranillo based, and usually they are, they can also be 100% Garnacha, something really interesting. In Navarra, you can also make rosé wine from Tempranillo, although Garnacha is the more common grape variety. In Castilla y León, there's a region known as Cigales, a very popular area for the production of Tempranillo rosés. On the Canary Islands, we love the rosés coming from a grape called Liston Negro. On the right-hand side here, this is Bodegas Bermejos. They're located on an island in the Canary Island called Lanzarote. It's the closest island to Africa, and it is the most bizarre topography for growing grapes you've ever seen. I recommend, if you haven't had a chance, if you've never seen Lanzarote, look up Lanzarote vineyards after this, and it looks like the surface of the moon. It's a crazy thing. In Germany, also we see production, of course, of these beautiful styles, right? So Saunier is the common style called Weiss Herbst is what they would call it. So a Saunier rosé bled away from the red juice. It's always made from a single variety. It has to be of at least QBA quality, the German appellation system. It's very popular in the region of Baden that we see in the south. Baden is just across the border from Alsace. So Alsace is kind of like a continuation of the Pfalz, just across the Rhine River from Baden over here. So if you have Pinot Noir in Alsace in France, it's usually coming from the Pinot Noir grape. And a lot of the time, the rosés coming from the Pfalz and Baden are made from Pinot Noir as well. You might also run into Schillerwein, where we actually co-ferment red and white grape together. This is one of the other areas where we allow it. That place in Spain we just talked about, Chacolina. Northern Spain, Basque Country, they also allow that blending of white and red grapes. The Schillerwein is much more common in the area of Württemberg, just to the east of Franken here as well. Austria, making really cool stuff. So there's a region in the south of Austria called Weststeiermark. They make a style of wine called Schulcher from a local indigenous grape known as Blauer Wildbacher. So if you are traveling in Austria, you see the Schulcher, the Blauer Wildbacher, definitely pick that up. It's very, very high acid. It's kind of tart. It's really intense. It's like nothing else you've ever had. It can be a little bit like Frisante, like not a sparkling wine, but just a little fizzy when you open the bottle. Rosalia is a newer DAC for the production of rosé coming from Zweigelt and Blaufränkisch. You can do a blend or either or, but you can't label it by varietal. So lights, Pinot Noir, we always like to include some of our favorite producers, and I'll send out a copy of these slides so you can also look this over in case you are at your local shop and you say, oh, I remember seeing that on the slides, I want to try it. So this is a favorite producer of ours from the Rheingau, Joseph Leitz, or Johannes, his father's name was Joseph, the winemaker now, his name is Johannes. Here we have a Grauburgunder. A Grauburgunder is the same grape variety as Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio. It can make orange or rosé wine because the skins of Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio are a very kind of like almost a pink, orange, or even dusty purple, depending on the exact variety of Pinot Grigio that you have. Die Frunde, Müller-Thurgau blend, Bacchus, Sylvaner. This is a really fun wine. A Zweigelt rosé coming from Austria. It's fermented on the skins of Gruner Veltliner. So it has a little more like peppery richness to it as well. And the Frisante, this is the Schulcher, Weststeiermark, the rosé coming from the native Blauer Wildbacher grape. You probably thought you'd never know so much about rosés. So, you know, California, it's kind of hard to generalize California for rosé production. And rosé really is being made everywhere, excuse me, everywhere as well. So definitely keep that in mind. But let's do what we can to generalize it, because we don't follow the same laws of the appellation system like we do in Europe, where I was able to very easily tell you that this appellation, this name on a bottle, tells you that it's going to be, if it's rosé, this grape variety, or if it just says this name, it's always going to be rosé, right? So we don't have the same strict laws regarding what grapes you can grow and how you can make your wines in the New World appellation, the United States, places like California. So we can kind of generalize, right? If you like more tart, crisp, high acid styles of rosé, you want to stay as close to the coast as you can. So Sonoma, West Sonoma coast, that Pinot Noir I mentioned from Ernest, Pay Vineyards, up here, Mendocino, close to the coast. When you get out into Monterey, you have a lot of Pinot Noir plantings here. And down here in Santa Barbara, where you actually have the coastal influence on two sides, making Santa Barbara, surprisingly, even though it's so far south. I mean, if you were just to, you know, head down the coast here, Santa Barbara, if you're just to head down the coast, like this is LA. Like that's how far south you are. It's not very far. This is not very far from like Malibu, like north coastal LA, right? So this is actually one of the coolest regions in California because of that influence of the cold Pacific on two sides, which is really interesting. If you like richer, riper, more textural rosés that maybe could stand up to being aged in oak, that give us more of that vanilla, that cinnamon, that clove aspect to the wine, you want to move inland. You want to look at places like Lake County. You want to look at places like Napa Valley. If you know where you are in Monterey, if you know that you're further inland, or in Santa Barbara, as you get further inland over here too, you have these bolder, riper, fruitier, and usually pack more of a punch, higher alcohol styles, right? So definitely keep that in mind. Do we still make white Zinfandel? Of course we do. But unfortunately, it, has kind of lost its favor and is associated with these sweeter styles of Zinfandel, of blush wine. Usually we associate blush not necessarily with just rosé wine, but with a sweet rosé wine, right? But however, the term really today, white Zinfandel and blush, is kind of being taken back by producers in California to actually make these really interesting and fresh and delicious styles of rosé that are actually coming from the Zinfandel grape. So when you see like your Beringer, your Franzia, your boxed wine that's white Zinfandel, usually it might have some Zinfandel. It's going to have some other grape variety that's probably not of the highest quality, but there are a lot of producers like Pax, like Jolie Lade, like Patrick Cappiello. These are all producers that are friends that hang out in Sonoma. So, I mean, yes, so now they're all making a white Zinfandel style. Patrick Cappiello, he used to be a sommelier here in New York City. His Monte Rio brand, he actually makes, it's kind of a throwback, and the wine is supposed to be great, but it's sort of a throwback to this older California, right? Where he's actually serving the wine in like a Carlo Rossi style jug. Like that's what the wine comes in. So definitely look for that, the Monte Rio white Zinfandel. I think it would be a really fun style to have. And we'll just finish off with a little bit of quick talking about how do we pair rosé wines. Rosé wines are fantastic for pairing because they possess the freshness of a white wine, the higher acidity, with some of the complexity and tannin of a red wine, right? So you can really pair them with a lot more than you can pair just rosé, or excuse me, just red or white wine with. But just to keep in mind, when you're thinking about pairing, always open your wine. So if you're planning to pair a wine with dinner, open your wine and taste it when you start making dinner, because it's going to be much easier to adjust whatever you're cooking to match with the wine than it's going to be to adjust the wine at all, right? So that means that the acidity in the wine needs to match or exceed the acidity of the food. You can adjust that in your food. Acidity in wine will decrease your perception of salt. So if you have these higher acid, cooler climate rosé wines, you can still have those with a lot of seafood. I would have rosé with things like oysters and clams. It cuts through greasier fried food, that high acid. It helps refresh the palate. It highlights simple flavors and good ingredients. We say that acidity in wine is like the gastronomical equivalent of a highlighter pen, and it just really helps focus on those kind of great high quality ingredients. Acidity also balances sugar. If you have residual sugar in your rosé wine, it needs to match or exceed the sweetness in the food. Otherwise, your wine will be a little flabby. Sweetness can help counter spice or physical heat. So remember the Cabernet d'Anjou or the Rosé d'Anjou, those sweet and off-dry, slightly sweet styles of rosé coming from the Loire Valley. What would you have those with? Anything that's spicy. So think barbecue that has spice, right? Barbecue, it's spicy, it's a little sweet, it's kind of vinegary. What could go better? Probably rosé is like the perfect pairing, right? Because you have higher acid, but you also have a little bit of sugar. You're countering the spice, you're matching the sugar, and you're matching the acidity in something like a barbecue sauce. It can counter the physical heat in things like chicken wings, Asian foods like Korean, Indian, Thai, Chinese, right? It can match salty elements. I love that kind of sweet and salty balance. Be careful of the alcohol in your wine. Higher alcohol can balance very weighty body and food, but higher alcohol in wine will exaggerate spice and salt, and vice versa. Tannin helps cut the fat and the protein. So you could drink a more tannic style of rosé wine, and oftentimes if you have a deeper color, you might associate that there would be more tannin in the wine too, although that's not always the case. But that tannin will help contrast the fat, the protein. The bitterness of tannin complements more bitter foods and bitter food preparations. So any of those kind of like green cruciferous vegetables that you might throw on the grill during the summertime, or things like radicchio or endive or escarole, right? These It's vegetables that you might make into a salad that have a kind of a bitter component to the flavor already. But tannin will accentuate the saltiness as well. And then oak. If you want to make your wine creamy or toasty or, have a little bit of bitterness to it, you might have oak to the wine. This would be fantastic. Of course, you don't see a ton of oaked rosé wines, but if you have bitter, bolder flavors in your food, you can definitely pair that with a rosé that has a bit more oak to it as well. Sorry guys, I didn't mean to keep you 10 minutes over. So it's a fun world of wine. We'll send out later on a little bit. I'll send up a little follow-up tomorrow, and if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks, Philip. I'm glad you could join us.
Thanks, Amber. That was great.
Enjoy your evening. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.